Are you ready?
All right. Welcome everybody to United Hudson, and I'm Pastor Tom Pride at Open Door Bible Church, and I'm here with a friend of mine, Chuck Hervis, who is a lawyer. I'll let him introduce himself in a second, but I wanted to let you know part of why I wanted to have this discussion is because we are in a situation that is unique. And there's a lot of talk going roundabout about the constitutionality of various things, especially with Michigan. And I have a friend in California who said, you know, Michigan's all over the news in California, partly because of Governor Whitmer's proclamation and then some opposition and then the protests that happened a little bit ago up in Lansing. And I've seen a lot of discussion about the constitutionality of the executive orders and just how we as churches should interact with the law. And I thought it would be a useful conversation to have and bring somebody in who actually knows what they're talking about. And so I'd like to introduce you all to my friend Chuck Hervis. Go ahead. Chuck, if you would introduce yourself and give us a little bit about yourself.
Thanks, Tom. Happy to do so. I've been practicing law since 1983. And when you refer to me as a constitutional lawyer, that's definitely what I do. Technically, it would be civil rights defense litigation. I represent law enforcement, correctional officers, jails, counties, sheriffs, when they get sued in civil rights cases. So many of these issues involve questions of the Constitution. So I'm a lawyer who's been to court, who has tried cases in federal court, has argued cases in the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals, and actually participated in 2 arguments in front of the U.S. Supreme Court, all involving law enforcement. Except at the beginning of my career, for about the first 15 years, I did a number of religious freedom cases. And so I have experience in dealing with First Amendment questions of freedom of religion, distribution of religious materials, things of that nature. And I've tried those cases as well as argued them in the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals. So my background is a practical, experienced lawyer who goes to court, who knows what to do in federal court in asserting or defending issues involving the Constitution.
Awesome, thank you. I wanted to start out by reading a letter that I got, or at least an excerpt from a letter that was sent to me from a pastor to Governor Whitmer. And I think it kind of kicks off this discussion really, really well. And I quote, "Due to your executive orders, you have stripped rights that are given by God, not by government. This is of grave concern. You have shuttered the physical doors of churches so that churches can no longer peaceably assemble, thereby violating the free exercise clause of the First Amendment. You have ordered that people stay home and not peaceably assemble with whomever they choose, therefore violating the First Amendment's clause that the people have a God-given right to peaceably assemble. You have directed medical devices for all who choose to purchase life-sustaining products. Thus, you make it impossible for people to actually live life without following your medical dictate, thus violating any right to private medical decisions that people may have. Please remember that if our rights do not hold in times of duress, then in my estimation, they are not rights at all. They are simply gifts given by benevolent executives when they so choose." And I thought that this encapsulates a lot of the concerns that I'm hearing on social media. And so I wanted to kind of kick off the discussion by talking about the limits. And so just easy question that seems foundational is, are constitutional freedoms unlimited or unbounded?
Let me start out with a little preface here so that we're working on the same set of rules. There are theoretical questions that can be asked that you can argue about in law school, that you can argue about in the U.S. Supreme Court about the way things should be. And I'm going to share with you the way things are. And so I don't want people to think that just because I've accepted the way the Constitution has been interpreted means that I may not have a philosophical view that's a differing opinion from actual practice. And so I'm giving you the nuts and bolts of what a lawyer who goes to court and has to argue the case is going to do. And so please don't misunderstand me in thinking that I've bought into something. I'm just giving you reality as to where we are today. as far as constitutional guarantees being unlimited, I find it to be a pretty easy question. They're not. I know that there's this feeling that you can go back to the Magna Carta and argue philosophically about what our God-given rights are. And we have encapsulated many of those in the US Constitution and Bill of Rights. But in practice, they're limited. And that's the, and I'm going to give you an example that's a real extreme example. To say that there's freedom of religion means that people can freely practice the religion of their choice, and we would acknowledge that they're free to do that. But there are real obvious limitations. If somebody said, well, I practice the religion of worship of Molech from the Old Testament, and we've got a small group of people, we worship Molech, and we're gonna sacrifice our firstborn once a year, and that's the way that's our religion, and we have a right to do that. That's a ludicrous situation, and we wouldn't tolerate it. And so, in that way, those individuals would say, well, my freedom of religion has been curtailed by the government's other interests in protecting life. So there's a balancing that happens. And to give you a more practical example, that happened in the 1800s when in Utah, a Mormon asserted the right to practice polygamy, and the United States Supreme Court said, you don't have that right under the Free Exercise Clause of religion.
So the short answer is no, there's obvious limits on it in various things. Like, I think my dad used to talk about free speech is limited by, you can express your opinion, but you can't go yell fire in a crowded theater.
Right. And the First Amendment, the free speech clause, is what the courts have really emphasized in terms of making it as free as possible. And yet there are some serious limitations to free speech depending on the circumstances.
So you mentioned that the compelling interest of the state's other things. Can you speak a little bit to that?
The way the court analyzes a freedom such as free speech or freedom of religion, in order for the state to regulate what it wants to, and I'll give you speech as an example, they have to prove a compelling state interest in order to regulate it. And I'm giving you the real short version of all that. And so that's, and a compelling state interest is very difficult to prove in a speech or religion case, meaning that you have to show that there is some significant issue of health or safety or welfare of the community. For instance, I gave this example on Facebook a while ago. If there's a church service that's going on and the government comes in and says, hey, by the way, there's a gas leak in your neighborhood and you need to evacuate immediately in the middle of a church service because there's a gas leak. I don't think a lot of people are going to be arguing with the government that you have a right to stay there. There's an emergency situation. The government can force the evacuation of the building in order to potentially save lives. So a compelling state interest has to be one that has a sufficient basis in fact for the government to say we can impose ourselves upon your freedom of religion or speech.
Right. So I think the impression that I think maybe those of us who aren't familiar with the legal the arguings and the particulars of it, that when someone says the state has a compelling interest, that feels very easy to me. That feels like somebody up in the government can say, hey, you know, our compelling interest says we can do this. And it feels like it's too easy an argument from this end of it out here in the cheap seats.
And the Supreme Court has been pretty aggressive in knocking down states when they do that. I think that you'll find that there's a lot of First Amendment cases coming out of the civil rights movement in which states said, or a city said, you got to have a permit to have a parade. You have to meet certain requirements. And the courts go in and analyze this and say, is this really justified under the circumstances? I think that what makes this relevant today, because most people haven't been arguing about whatever compelling state interests are. The one that I gave you about protection of life, to not allow religious people to kill people, is an obvious compelling state interest. The real question now is, what is the nature of a compelling state interest in a national emergency. And that's where the courts are generally going to give a lot of leniency to the government to manage the emergency on a temporary basis as best they can. And the courts are actually going to be hesitant to start managing for the government how it should be. So the courts want to stay out of it as much as possible. There are some exceptions to that.
Like what would exceptions be?
Well, the obvious exception would be if in controlling the emergency, if religion was treated different than other things, such as the real obvious example, we're going to say, well, we think it's okay to go to a drive-in theater, but it's not okay to have a drive-in situation at church. And the only distinction is we just don't think church should be allowed, but theaters should be. That would be a distinction that the courts would step in real quick and say, that makes no sense. That's not within your right of you're not satisfying the standard of a compelling state interest in that. You're treating people unequally there.
And I think we saw that in a case in California, and then Mississippi's kind of similar arguments along those lines.
Actually, there was that's true, and there was an order that just happened a week ago in Kansas, in which a federal judge struck down specific regulations on church because the judge found it inconsistent. So that has happened, and that's to be expected when religion is treated different than the general population.
And I think that in fairness to, for instance, our own governor, I don't think we've seen that distinction play out in that respect. So group prohibitions have been true in Michigan. That's been across the board. And even I think Michigan has gone one step further and said, we're not actually going to even prosecute churches that do choose to meet together, which I think is kind of an interesting way to handle that.
If I just mention this, if the government takes a real draconian approach and says we're going to shut down absolutely everything, that's actually a safer position to take legally because you're not discriminating against anybody that way. And the problem then is that you've restricted people so much that it begins to make no sense under the circumstances for anything. And I think part of that's what's going on in Michigan. It's when you start making those distinctions and say, you can do this, you can have, like I said, a drive-in theater, but you can't have drive-in church. That's when you really have a problem. And I'm not sure that's happened in Michigan. I don't know. I'm in Illinois.
I think from a right standpoint, like one of the things that we've seen is, for instance, the stores aren't allowed to sell gardening supplies, which in Detroit is no big deal, but out here where everybody gets a significant amount of their food, or a lot of people do, by gardening, and having a large, 1 or 2 acre garden is not uncommon in our area.
Yeah,
that's kind of a big thing, and I think that kind of parsing of distinctions is what has felt as overreach by a lot of people. I think that's a bit of a political discussion, because I actually think she did overreach politically, but I'm really interested in the constitutional part of it, because I think that in terms of whether she's overreached politically or not is a different question than whether she's violated the Constitution.
And again, I'm going to say that the courts are going to give a lot of deference to the government in a national emergency. Another example of when the courts do that is when it involves the military. The federal courts are hands off on the military when it comes to constitutional rights. And so if there's an issue in which the military is involved, you're not going to see the courts involved in that too much. So there's a deference that's happening right now, except for unequal treatment.
Is there anything in this that's worthy of us to say, hey, maybe we're a little concerned that some of our constitutional freedoms are being nipped away and aren't going to come back? Is that a legitimate concern?
The answer is yes, it is a legitimate concern. However, it's a concern because I know that there's this distrust of government, and I think that the founding fathers had that same distrust of government, that once they have a power grab, they're going to keep it. The real issue here is it temporary or not? And if it's meant to be temporary, if it's explicitly temporary, and the governors of the various states have issued disaster proclamations, states of emergencies, and they're all based on a temporary situation. They're usually either 30 to 60 days, something of that nature. And that's what the courts are going to look to, because they're going to say this is not a permanent situation, it's a temporary situation. So I think that in all fairness, there are a tremendous number of civil rights groups out there that are going to be all over this on the conservative and the liberal side to make sure that temporary means temporary.
Another thing that the idea of the freedom of movement has come up in a lot of questions with respect to like in our state. Governor Whitmer said we're not allowed to go from one house that we own to another house that we own in the state. And so that's kind of been objectionable to people saying, you know, I'm building a house. I'm the only person there, and they're not allowing me to travel in between those two places that I own.
Yeah. Well, that there's an issue about whether that makes sense or not. There's another issue whether it's constitutional or not. And the bottom line is, during a state of emergency, what I would consider that, I'd make the argument that it's an over-inclusive regulation, meaning it covers way too much. It shouldn't be that. It should be more narrowly tailored to meet the needs of preventing the pandemic. That argument works great on a constitutional level, but when you're trying to argue about whether the governor is making good decisions or not good decisions during a national emergency, the courts won't buy it. So I can assert my Fifth Amendment right to travel, which is recognized by the U.S. Supreme Court. But if I went to court on that, the court would say on a temporary basis, you can be restricted because of a national emergency, and therefore that is the compelling interest that overrides your situation, but it has to be temporary.
So on a temporary basis, it's allowable, but it might not be politically expedient.
Definitely.
I think that one's going to really blow up on her from a political standpoint. But again, trying to keep this on the legal front so that people have some understanding to base on. That does bring me up to the 10th Amendment and the difference between the state's power and the federal power, because I know that's caused some confusion, I think, in the political discussion with respect to what is Trump responsible for making happen versus what are the states responsible for in terms of the police powers. Can you speak to that at all?
Yes, that's a little bit of that's a complicated issue. The 10th Amendment has gotten a little bit more play in the last 20 to 30 years, and a part of it has to do with the conservative nature of the judges and the conservative tilt of the U.S. Supreme Court. And so the idea there that certain rights are reserved to the states is being acknowledged as a positive thing. But the reach of the federal government is so pervasive in our society today that the Commerce Clause has been interpreted in a way that gives the government tremendous power over all the states. And the other area where the government has power is the federal government is through funding, because they control the money. And so they can literally say, if you don't follow the rules that we make for you, we're going to withhold funding from you. So while President Trump can give guidelines for states, which he's actually done on the reopening. And by the way, when he first said that he was going to decide all that, I knew that constitutionally he couldn't do it. That's a state issue. And then he backed down the next day, and it turned into a voluntary thing. And it's being handled correctly now, where the federal government provided the guidelines. And I guess even in the news yesterday or today, the president was disagreeable with the Republican governor of Georgia, saying, I don't think you're doing this right. But he wasn't forcing the issue. If he wanted to force the issue, he couldn't decree it, But he might say, if you don't do what I say, you're not going to get certain kinds of funding. That's where the federal government has certain powers.
Right. And I think that is helpful to understand why the interplay, and it's created some confusion, I think, with respect to the relationship, for instance, in Michigan, our state governor to Trump, I think has had some tension in it, and it seems to be related to that particular discussion, at least from my perspective.
Same thing in Illinois. Governor Pritzker and Governor Trump, and I'm sorry, President Trump haven't really been getting along that well. And so it's really an issue of what powers are federal and which ones are state. And this pandemic is kind of highlighting where the federal government can go and what it can do. Again, they have tremendous power through money.
So let's say we disagree from a political standpoint, and while it might be constitutional, we're feeling a little bit constricted of our freedoms. We want to protest. So I know the big protest happened in Lansing. In what way would that be protected? Or is that kind of one of those things where it's more politically expedient for everybody just to wink and let it go?
Are you asking about your First Amendment rights there to protest?
Yeah. So like, for instance, if you say, hey, nobody can move, nobody can talk during this emergency, it seems like there's no real recourse for the citizens to say, hey, we object.
Now you're going to get into some of my libertarian tendencies, but I'm not going to go there. And so
you're in good company in Michigan.
Yeah. And I said tendencies. I didn't say I was a libertarian.
Right.
but the point there is that there really is the only recourse you have is to assert a right in court, or you just engage in civil disobedience, and then you have to live with the consequences of that. And so people who are violating social distancing, or I like to call it physical distancing, by these protests are setting themselves up for having to live with the consequences. Let me give you an example of something that I was involved with as a lawyer. About 30 years ago or so, there were numerous abortion protests that were done by people who literally were blocking abortion clinics and laying down and allowing themselves to get arrested. And so that was the way they wanted to bring attention to it. So it was a massive civil disobedience issue. They were breaking the law, and many of them went to jail. And so I had represented certain protesters in there, and in the Chicago area, it turned into something where the courts they didn't want to throw people in jail for that, because they didn't have enough room for those people. They had criminals who needed to be locked up because they were dangerous to society. And so I was involved in helping get them off, get reduced sentences, probation, that sort of a thing. And so my point there is that that's an example of people making decisions to engage in civil disobedience, but you have to be willing to assume the consequences, and those consequences could be fairly serious to you.
Right. So it's civil disobedience is kind of we tend to, as a society, protect it, but there's also like this line of where it's too much, or it seems to be very socially determined where that line is.
I think that the important thing, if I can use a biblical example, is Paul asserting his Roman citizenship, in which he he had certain rights that he was entitled to, but those rights were clearly defined in the law, and people respected and followed that. He didn't go outside the law in those circumstances. He said, "You shouldn't be beating me. I'm a Roman citizen." And then people were like, "Uh-oh, we could have a problem here." And then Paul had his appeal to Caesar. And so all of those are examples of Paul using his citizenship appropriately, and us as citizens have a right to do that too. But it was all within the context of how the system was operating, not necessarily how people believe the system should be operating.
That opens up an kind of like maybe more of a bigger sort of philosophical question. but it's basically how are we as Christians, how are we good citizens? We're in the middle of this. I know that there's concerns about, how do we act as a church? Do we follow the law? Do we fudge a little bit on it, even because so there's no risk to me as a pastor, right? If I say we're going to have church, I have maybe a social risk because everybody's going to say, "Wow, Tom, that's really dumb." But there's not a political risk to me. They've already said they're not going to prosecute churches. There's no provision or fine for churches in that respect. It was actually written into the order. And so, but yet I think there's something as Christians that we should maybe think about and kind of wrestle through, which is what's my relationship to the government, and when do I say, no, we're going to do what we're going to do.
Given that a lot of pastors are watching this, I think that many of you are more qualified to respond to that than I am in terms of a Romans 13 situation and our obligations to the government. But it would seem to me that, and I'm going to go a little bit outside my practice area here, and that is that as Christians, there is a time when we might have to say, I'm going to engage in civil disobedience because God has commanded me a certain way under certain circumstances. And I'm not sure that this pandemic emergency is one of those times to be asserting that, because there is a rational basis in science to say that physical distancing is a beneficial thing to do right now. And even if we disagree with it, the issue is people that are responsible for running an orderly government have decided that that's the right way to do it. I guess if they locked us down for months upon months upon months, at a certain point in time, you'd have to say enough is enough. But we are really early into this thing, and it would seem wiser to me. Let me just say this. I was going to say as a Christian to do that, but even as a lawyer, if somebody comes to me and says, I want to assert my rights, I'm not going to be able to do anything in court in the main unless they were treated unequally, which we've seen how some of the courts have handled. But if it's simply, I have the right to be in church, I want to have my church of, whether it's like, let's say 80 people, and I don't care what the governor says, I have a right to do that right now, this Sunday. I would suggest that right, well, philosophically, you can make a great argument for it, but practically speaking, you're not going to win in court on something like that.
Right. That kind of reminded me of the Attorney General Barr's statement with respect to the case in Mississippi, in the Church of Mississippi. I wanted to read that, so if other people watching on Facebook or YouTube haven't seen it. He says this. He says, but even in times of emergency, when reasonable and temporary, that kind of goes back to what we've been talking about, reasonable and temporary restrictions are placed on rights, the First Amendment and federal statutory law prohibit discrimination against religious institutions and religious believers. Thus, government may not impose special restrictions on religious activity that do not also apply to similar non-religious activity. For example, if a government allows movie theaters, restaurants, concert halls, and other comparable places of assembly to remain open and unrestricted, it may not order houses of worship to close, limit their congregation size, or otherwise impede religious gatherings. Religious institutions must not be singled out for special burdens. And I think maybe in those cases where it is being singled out in terms of religion, where that's being specifically singled out, maybe that is an appropriate place for churches to rise up and say, that's not allowed.
Yeah, absolutely. And what you just read, that's the law. And I don't really think that a lot of people could argue that that's not how the law would be applied. And that's what we're seeing in special circumstances. Some courts have come down and said, no, you can't treat religion unequally in those circumstances.
Is there anything else maybe that you would say is worthy for us as pastors to consider with respect to how we manage ourselves in regards to these situations, just from a legal standpoint?
Yeah. That's an interesting question. It can go a lot of directions. I'm also the attorney for our town. I'm a village attorney for a small town here, and we do a lot. Our firm does a lot of work with government officials, giving them advice and things of that nature. I think that from a practical standpoint, I would tell you that having done this for a long time, and by the way, I also served on the city council of a big suburban town in this area for 4 years, and I also served on the local school board for 8 years. So I have experience as a public official. I have experience as a lawyer giving advice to public officials. And in the main, public officials are interested in doing the right thing. They're interested in getting reelected. They're interested in getting elected, and they want to get along with people. And I would think that pastors working, seeking relationships with the public officials in town and things of that nature is a very positive thing, and would encourage that, because it also gives the pastor a better understanding of why the town may want to regulate or do certain things, but it also would give the town some sensitivity, because we should be careful, because I know those people, and they're good people, you know, they're good citizens, they want to do the right thing, so let's all try to work together. So I don't know if that's answering your question, Tom, but that's something that I think is really important. I also think, go ahead if you wanted to say something.
It does speak to what we're doing as United Hudson Churches, that we are trying to include our town officials and our state representatives, largely because we want to be a cooperative influence in our society, not just a little isolated silos off doing our own thing, but rather to be participating in our culture and in our society. So I think that's a really good suggestion. What was the other thing you were going to mention?
I was just going to say that from our the perspective of our Christian witness, I think that when it's time to stand up and say, I'm going to assert my rights in court, people respect that when it's a situation that is reasonable. But during a pandemic, I think the average person realizes, you know, this may not be a good idea for people to gather together in a church of 200 when everyone else is being real careful about things like that. So I think that there's something to say about what our Christian witness says about our circumstances and being sensitive to people around us, and the reason for these restrictions. If the reason was unreasonable and it was singling out, I think people would expect us to assert our rights and say, that's not right, we're going to stand up for that. I just don't think that this is one of those times, unless it was for unfair treatment. I just don't think it's one of those times, because I think the courts for sure are not going to be sensitive to it. I can tell you that, just as an aside, one of the things that the lawyers in our office and other lawyers around the country have done is to share certain court orders of people who have been aggressive in court over stupid issues. And the courts have said, we are in the middle of a pandemic, and you lawyers want to argue about a deposition procedure. And I mean, there's a couple of opinions out there that are short that really dress the lawyers down and make fun of how dumb they were. And so the lawyers pass them around and say, hey, you know, do you see what the judge did in this particular court? And so that's the attitude the judges have. You better have something really serious if you're coming to me in the middle of a pandemic.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. So let's suppose Governor Whitmer makes an extension. In that extension, I don't expect her to, but suppose she singles out churches and says, you know, churches especially can't do this or that, but theaters can, just to kind of put a hypothetical in there. Now we want to say, hey, sorry, that we're not going to respond to that. I think that we've seen that kind of response actually result in positive defenses of religious liberty in other states like California or Mississippi.
Right.
And I think that would be the course of action we would take.
Yes.
And that's where I wanted to talk just briefly about, how do we protect our constitutional rights? Is this in the public arena? Is this in the courts? What are kind of our options?
There's a couple of answers to that. The first one is education. We need to be aware of what our rights are. Civics and government are really important. And as I view the news and people in general, I think that there is a tremendous lack of education in civics and government, Constitution. And unfortunately, I'll say this too, there's also misinformation about it. For instance, this idea that our constitutional rights or our guarantees are unlimited, that's just not true. And so you can say, I believe in the Constitution, but you may have a view that's not a correct view of the Constitution. Again, I want to make a distinction between what is philosophical and what is practical in terms of what can be accomplished in court today. So education is number one, understanding and knowing what our rights are. And number two is the assertion of those rights in the manner prescribed by law, meaning you have the right to go to court, and there are several organizations that will assist Christian people, churches, in asserting those rights in the appropriate circumstance. So I would encourage Christian people to say, we need to understand what our rights are and not be afraid to exercise those rights. I'm a big proponent of that. I don't have a problem with that. And that's coming from a lawyer who spends his time defending public officials. And so I've sued public officials when I feel that religious rights were violated. So I don't want to give anybody the impression that I don't think that's right to do. I think I would be aggressive with exercising those rights, just like the Apostle Paul said, I'm a Roman, I'm going to exercise all the rights of Roman citizenship.
I think that's a great principle and a great foundation for that. And I think when we want to assert our rights, I think then from a pastor's perspective, one of the things that concerns me is that we do it in a way that is righteous, that we make sure we've got our ducks in a row, that we're being reasonable. I know there was a case that I read about in Florida where I thought the pastor was being extremely unreasonable in the way that he did it, and the way, it was very brash. And I thought that that's just not a good way to defend our rights, but rather to be respectful to government, as Romans says, honor to whom honor, but yet at the exact same time, to not be shy about asserting our rights, I think is the right approach.
I'd agree with that.
Anything else you'd like to add before we close?
I didn't know if there were any questions that anybody had that anybody submitted.
I haven't received. I've got a bunch of people watching, and notifications of that, but I haven't received any further questions beyond the ones that I had already that we've already addressed and answered. So I guess we've been so thorough that everybody is just informed without having any questions. So I would like to thank you. I know that it's very likely that later on in the comments through Facebook, we're very likely to get some further questions, and we'll see if we can't maybe answer some of those along the way as well. But I wanted to thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it, and it's a real blessing and a blessing to our town, and I just really appreciate it.
You're welcome. I'm happy to help. It's nice to see you again, Tom.
It's nice to see you too. And we'll see everybody when we can. Have a good day.
Thank you. Bye.